So we're now at a stage where we can start to process our raw images. So if you remember, we've already gone and set up the color management settings for Photoshop, so that any images coming into Photoshop will actually acknowledge the fact that it might have a different color space assigned, and it will not attempt to change that color space. We've set up Adobe Camera Raw in a way that we want it to work for this particular project, because we're aiming to produce JPEG images for the pictures to actually show. So now we're in Bridge, we've sorted all our images, and I've even sorted them into a collection. So we know that the original images were across two folders. There they are, there. And I color coded or applied labels to the ones I wanted, and then I dragged the labeled images into the collection so that this is an amalgamation of all the red labeled images from Fairford there and Fairford there. I've sized these thumbnails here so that we get like 10 thumbnails visible across the screen here, and you can do that by just dragging that slider left or right. The idea is that we don't want to just process one image at a time, because it'd take forever. We've got 322 to get through. I probably won't use all 322. In fact, I know I won't. You'll probably end up with using about 80 or less pictures. But at least by processing these, I'll have the option to either add or remove them from the project when I get going. So to speed things up, we're going to select the first one there, press the Shift key, select the one at the end of the row, all of them in between become selected, and then we're going to send these to Camera Raw. So I'm going to press Ctrl and R for Rodney, and there they all are. Okay, we can just use the scroll bar down there. Okay, so the one that is selected, the one that you can see here, is the one with a little blue border around it. Okay, just select whichever one you want to work on. We'll just confirm that the workflow options here have remained at sRGB 8 bits per channel. So these are the settings we want Camera Raw to send the images to Photoshop with these attributes. If we're doing a high quality print, of course, these are not the ideal settings for doing that. But for this particular project, that's what we want. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this image here, and then apply the settings that I've done on this one to all the rest of them, because they look as if they could do with a similar sort of treatment. All the exposures look similar. So whatever we do to that one, we'll probably need to do to all the rest of them. And I don't want to have to do it 10 times. So we'll do a bit of treatment to this one, and then we'll synchronize the settings from this one to all the rest. Probably one of the first things we need to do is just look at the color temperature. I think it's done a reasonable job of this. The camera, this is set as shot by the camera. And my camera usually does a fairly good rendering color temperature wise. You could, if you wish, go to the white balance tool, select an area that you think should be a neutral gray, and wherever you click, it will synchronize. It will make all the red, green and blue colors identical for that particular spot underneath the eyedropper there. Okay, and if you do it somewhere like the blue, it will make a right mess of it, because again it's synchronized all the red, blue and red, green and blue colors to try and balance them out, and of course all the rest of the image gets changed the same. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our shot, or you could actually select one of these others, auto, daylight, which are presets, and that is how Adobe thinks daylight ought to be rendered. Okay, well, I'll go back to our shot. Now, aircraft and birds in flight, especially on a bright sunny day, there's a huge contrast range between the white areas that could be in bright sunlight and the dark areas which could be in deep shadow. So you've got a huge contrast range there, or brightness range. So we need to try and bring back detail in the shadows and conserve the detail in the highlights, specular highlights like this. And we can do that by going to the highlights slider and dragging that to the left, and I'll do that to, I usually go to about 75, 80 or so. And the shadows, and if you watch the shadow area here, as I drag the slider to the right, you can see that we're starting to get information in the shadow areas. Okay. The whites, I'm going to press the Alt key, and as I drag the Alt key, we can start to see where it's starting to become clipped. I don't really want too much clipping other than specular highlights, so I'm going to leave that about there. And if we go to the blacks slider, we'll drag that to the left until we get just a little bit of clipping there. So we've got a nice contrast range. So we've got a full, the histogram is fully populated. You can see that this blue area, the sky, is actually made up of red, green and blue. These are the predominant colors because that is the main area of the image. But you can see that it isn't as identical red, green and blue. You can see that we've got predominance of red, of blue, less of green and less of red. Okay, so that's what makes up that main color there. All the rest of the histogram is basically made up of the colors and tones of the aircraft. We can maybe add a little bit of clarity. So this sort of image benefits from some added clarity, and that just adds some increased contrast in the midtones of the image. And I usually add a little bit of vibrance and maybe just back off the saturation just a little bit like that. The exposure looks pretty good. Might just boost it just a tad because I usually underexpose just a little bit for aircraft and birds in flight so that I retain detail in the whites and the highlights as best as I can. So the resulting images do tend to be just a little bit underexposed after I've taken them. So those are the main settings that I do with the basic panel. I then go to the detail panel, and if we look here we can see that it's been taken at an ISO rating of 400, and a lot of my pictures are taken at 400 or 800 ISO. So a bit of noise reduction will be useful. When you're doing noise reduction, it's best to zoom into your images to at least 100%. Now you're not going to see an awful lot of noise in here because it's only 400 ISO. But for these sorts of images, if I just standardize this, because I can create a preset which I'll show you later. And for some of the 800 ISO images, a luminance noise reduction setting of about 10 will be appropriate. I'm going to leave all the rest of the noise reduction settings as they are there. But sharpening, I'm going to apply a little bit of pre-sharpening to these images. Okay, this isn't final sharpening that you need to do in Photoshop. And I'm going to set that to 40. And I'm going to leave the rest of these sliders as is, but drag the masking slider. I'm pressing the Alt key now. And any areas that you see are black, there'll be no sharpening applied to it. But any areas that are white, around all the detail, that's where we want the sharpening to be applied. We don't want sharpening to be applied to the sky or any other areas where you got a very subtle tone gradation. So Alt key, drag the slider, and I usually end up again around about 75 to 80 setting there. Okay, let's just go back to the basic panel, Control 0 to zoom out. So I can say that those are the settings that I think are appropriate for this particular image, and they're probably going to be the same for the rest of these. So I want to synchronize what I've done here on this image across all 9 images. So I can select, make sure we've got the top one select. This is what's called the most selected. I'm going to press Control A, and you can see all the rest of them become highlighted, but the one that I was just working on still retains that blue highlight around it. Okay, so that is what's called the most selected. So whatever I do to these images will be based on the attributes of that image there. I could have gone to, see this little menu here? I could have just gone to there and selected all. There you go, Control A. But now we want to synchronize the most selected image across the rest of the images, even the ones that are just off screen here. And we can do that by going to Sync Settings or Alt S. Just drag that there. And here we have the option of choosing which attributes of this image we want to transfer over to all the rest. And I'll leave them as they are there. We haven't done any cropping, spot removal, local adjustments, so I'll leave those unticked. But all of the rest you can leave selected. You've got drop downs for, you can just select other combinations of ticks that you want to apply. You could just have one tick if you wish to apply a particular attribute to all the others, all the images. But we'll leave that as it is. Select OK, and you'll see the thumbnails update. Okay, and if I select that one there, you can see that all the sliders, that one there, all the sliders are identical now because we've synchronized those settings across all of the images. So now we could just go through each one of these, maybe just making little tweaks if need be to each individual image. And I'm not going to do that in this instance, but you can see the principle. Okay, so now we could select the first one, Control A, select them all, and looking at the workflow options, we can now open the images into Photoshop. And now we can see that all the images have been opened into Photoshop, ready for us to start doing some further work on them.